Ariel Helwani in Montreal for UFC 154 alongside UFC Canada's Director of Operations, Mr. Tom Wright himself. And Tom, it's so good to be back in Canada, so good to be back in Montreal. It's been a while since the UFC has been back here. Why 2 years? Well, why the layoff from Montreal?
Well, if you remember, we were actually going to be here in March for UFC, I'm going to say 145, and we ended up having to postpone that event, and we ended up going to Atlanta. So it's been, just one of those scheduling quirks. I mean, we've, as you know, this is the 5th time we've been to Montreal, the 11th time in Canada, so I think only maybe Anaheim has ever held any more events other than Las Vegas. So Montreal is a great fight city. It's a great town. It's a beautiful environment here. You're from Montreal, you should know that.
Yes.
And the Bell Center is going to be rocking. It's going to be awesome.
I know you weren't around in, what was it, 2008, UFC 83, and then UFC 124, right before your time.
No, I was here for UFC 124, Koscheck and George.
Yes, you started 115, right? That was around.
Correct.
I was thinking the Vancouver event was around the time that you started, so I got my numbers mixed up. Can you compare the buzz then to the 124 compared to now with GSP coming back after this long layoff?
Well, it's a different kind of a buzz because, when at UFC 124, you recall, George and Josh were both coaches on The Ultimate Fighter, and there was a lot of what you didn't see here today. There was a lot of trash talking. There was a lot of confrontation from the Koscheck side, as you know. I mean, George is George, and I think Carlos is Carlos. One of the things he talked about today is that he is who he is, and so while you had the sort of the hype of tough leading up to UFC 124. This thing has been the hype and the excitement of George coming back. So it's a different kind of a buzz. I think there's tremendous anticipation of people wanting to see George come back. They want to. I mean, they know that if there's any guy who's going to take care of his body, it's George. But until you see that knee in action, you're not really sure what's going to happen. And so I think there's sort of that interesting notion of let's watch what happens. And Carlos is as George said, it's probably his toughest opponent, and I think it's going to be a fascinating fight to watch. I know everybody's looking forward to it.
How are ticket sales?
Ticket sales have been great. I mean, this will be our 3rd largest gate this year after Las Vegas and Calgary. We're well north of $3 million, which is a fabulous gate. We still have a few tickets left to sell. We've made some production changes at the Bell Center. There still are some for sale, but we couldn't be happier.
As far as media coverage is concerned, I've always thought that the Montreal media in particular has not given George the coverage that he deserves during his climb up the ladder here in the UFC. Has the lockout in the NHL helped this event? Because, of course, there's less to talk about, especially here in Montreal, no Canadians playing. Has that helped you guys? Have you noticed that?
You know what? I haven't really directly noticed that. I would tell you the bigger difference is that we've got a brand new relationship with TVA Sports here in Quebec, and TVA is owned by Quebecor, and Quebecor is a large media company, so they're giving us a lot more support. I think the other big difference that we've had historically is that more and more, in fact, all of our pay-per-view fights are now broadcasted internationally in French. So we've got consistency of our sport, consistency of our athletes coming forward. And so people in Quebec are being exposed on a regular basis to mixed martial arts in the UFC. And that's a big difference over the past, because leading into UFC 124, The Ultimate Fighter wasn't in French. Maybe I might have had 2 or 3 events that were held internationally that were actually broadcasted here in Quebec in French. And you're from here, you know that the Quebecers love to watch their sports in their language. And we respect that, and we made those changes. And so I think you're seeing that as a difference as well.
How much has it hurt not having GSP fight for the organization for the last 2 years, as far as financially, the growth of the sport here in Canada? Have you noticed a difference with him not being around?
Well, sure. I mean, you can't help but notice a difference. I mean, in Canada, he's by far and away the #1 pay-per-view draw. Always has been, and we expect we'll set our highest pay-per-view numbers for this calendar year will be this fight, because George is George, and when he doesn't fight, obviously there's an impact. There's an impact not only in pay-per-view, but there's impact in other parts of the business as well. But the fact of the matter is that he is back. We're excited about it. I think he's going to put on a great show. Both he and Carlos have put on a great show, and the entire card is a great card. There's 10 Canadians on it, as you know, and I think it's going to be a great opportunity for Canadians. And you talked about in the absence of hockey, to Canadians in the absence of hockey, who may not have sampled mixed martial arts or tried the UFC. You're going to see that coming out in droves on Saturday night, because not much else to do.
Now, you announced recently that the UFC is returning to Montreal in March. Why the quick turnaround? I asked you about the layoff. Now, why such a quick turnaround?
We're coming back on March 16th at the Bell Center again, which is a Saturday. You will recall that one of our goals, particularly for UFC Canada, was to establish a consistency and a predictability of our schedule. It's great for our fans, it's great for our business partners, it's great for our broadcast partners, and we wanted to establish both Montreal and Toronto as tentpole events and tentpole dates in our UFC calendar. Not unlike Super Bowl Saturday and in Vegas and the long weekends in Memorial Day and July 1st in the U.S. And so we've always wanted to have March at the third Saturday in March as our tentpole event in Montreal, and the third Saturday in September as the tentpole date in Toronto. Predictable dates, just like the Grey Cup, like the Super Bowl, like UFC on Memorial Day, and that's so we're coming back in Montreal to establish that date, and we'll be back in March of 2015.
And Tom Wright is a true Canadian when he says July 1st in the U.S. That is Canada Day. July 4th in the U.S. is the Independence Day.
Well, I know that.
I forgive you.
I know that, but you didn't know when I started, so now we're even, okay, buddy?
Absolutely. Now, exactly. Any idea who will be fighting on that card? That's not too far away.
It's not too far away, and I don't know exactly who's going to be on it. I've heard some conversations. I've spoken with Dana and Lorenzo about it. But
tell us about those conversations.
As you well know, Ariel, I'm not Joe Silva, and I'm not Dana White, and I'm not Sean Shelby. And so until it comes out of one of their three voices, you won't know.
If GSP wins on Saturday night, will you be pushing to have a potential super fight with Anderson Silva in Toronto? Dana talked about Toronto being one of the three cities that they're looking at.
You know what? I have those conversations with those guys in Vegas all the time. I think we'll have to use Dana's traveled phrase. We'll have to wait and see. And so Toronto is obviously an option. The Rogers Center would be a great spot. We've filled it once. We could do it again, but there are other places as well. So we'll have to wait and see.
Two last quick things. UFC Canada. When will that debut? Excuse me. Tough Canada. When will that debut?
I have every expectation that it'll debut in 2013, but until it is... Now, that's something you can come to me, and I will give you the date when the date is done, but we're not quite finished with the dates, but I'm looking for, hopefully, towards the latter part of 2013.
Exclusive?
Say again?
Exclusive. Will you give it to us exclusively?
Depends how well you like it.
Oh, wow.
Depends if you remember my start dates.
Wow. That one really bothered you. I apologize for that.
I'm teasing you.
Any idea about the format, though? Will it be some sort of different kind of format because it's in Canada? I don't know.
We've talked about that. We've talked about whether it's East versus West, whether it's French versus English, whether it's Canada versus Quebec. It'll be an interesting format when it comes out.
Okay, and you've talked about other cities hosting UFC events in 2013, not named Toronto and Montreal. Break the news for us. Where's the UFC coming in 2013?
I can only break the news of Toronto and Montreal.
All right.
Sorry, buddy.
That's it.
But as soon as I can break the news, I'd be happy to do it.
And finally, the biggest question of them all, I saved the best for last. Montreal, Toronto, Saturday, conference finals in the CFL, and Calgary and BC. Who's the former commish picking?
The former commish is picking the Argos is going to come out of the East.
In Montreal, you say that.
Dans la belle Provence.
Wow.
C'est incroyable, oui. The last time they did that was 2004.
Okay.
They won the East final here in Montreal, and they went on to win the Grey Cup that year. I'm picking the Lions to come out of the West.
All right. Well, a pleasure as always. I apologize once again for forgetting when you debuted in the UFC, but
and I apologize to all the Americans for calling July 4th July 1st. But Canada Day has a much nicer ring than July 4th, right?
Wow, he said that. Those are big words from Tom Wright, UFC Canada's Director of Operations. UFC 154 goes down this Saturday night live from the Bell Center here in Montreal, live on pay-per-view. George St-Pierre versus Carlos Condit. Thank you so much, Tom, and good luck on Saturday.
Anytime, Ariel. Thanks, buddy.